economies have shown very diverse growth performance over the past half century. It is true that significant number of economies has made very sustained growth, catching up with advanced economies like US or Japan in terms of their per capita income. But however, there is also concern that many emerging economies will never match the advanced economies and would be rather trapped in a middle income status. I think many people in Thailand or Malaysia, in many ASEAN countries would feel in that kind of worry. In economics, recently, some people argue that the so-called middle income trap hypothesis, which implies that an economy transitioning from the middle income to a high income status is more likely to experience a sharp growth slowdown and then failing to advance to the high income status. And the low income countries could become the middle income countries, and the middle income countries can grow quite easily. But once a country becomes upper middle income status, it would be more difficult to become the high income countries. So let me start with some data. This is I'm not sure you can see it, but this data shows the growth performance of the 110 economies starting from 1960 to 2014. So horizontal axis is the per capita income in 1960. This is in economics we call the purchasing power parity adjusted income. This is looking at the power of purchasing. And then vertical axis is the average per capita GDP growth rate over the half century. And then you can see that some countries are noted in different colors. Top 15 countries are in blue color. So that include mostly Asian countries. They were very poor in 1960, but they grow very fast, including Thailand here. And then bottom 15 countries, including 9 sub-Saharan African countries, showed very worst performance over the past half centuries. So first question is, what caused this diverse growth performance? Why countries cannot move to the high-income countries as current high-income countries did over the past years? So let's focus on some selected economies. This is the change of the per capita income over time, starting from 1960 to 2014. So here, this is the United States, and then this is the Singapore, and this is the South Korea. So now you can see the several successful East Asian economies, including Singapore and South Korea, have rapidly caught up with the United States in per capita income by making very strong and persistent growth. Thailand is here. So Thailand showed very strong growth, but since Asian financial crisis, the growth rate has slowed down and then stayed as a middle-income countries. The definition of middle-income countries I'll explain later, but let's say just look at how fast the middle-income country has caught up to the advanced countries in per capita income. Here, benchmark is the United States. Of course, some Latin American countries, the performance was much worse. Here, I show the Brazil and Mexico. Initially, they started at a better position, but they slowed down. Look at here. This country is the Mexico. After their crisis in 1980, they could not catch up to the United States. So compared to the Latin American countries, Thailand is much better. But the worst case here is the bottom country. This is the Democratic Republic of Congo. They show the negative GDP growth rate. So this kind of diverse growth performance, as I explained, raising many questions. So my presentation today, trying to focus answering several key questions. So what are the factors making middle-income countries achieving rapid convergence to a high-income status? We call convergence means the catching up. But some other countries, what caused the other groups to suffer from the significant growth slowdown, deceleration, thereby being trapped in a middle-income status? Like Mexico is the one example. And then data support the middle-income trap hypothesis, means the middle-income country like Thailand now getting more difficulty to become high-income countries because it has already reached to the upper middle-income country, or it's the same difficulty as it experienced when it moved from the low-income countries to the lower middle-income countries. Always we feel we are getting into the more difficulties, but maybe that's the perception. Getting out from the low-income or poverty would be more difficult than to become the high-income countries. If we ask the same question to the African countries, they will say getting out of the poverty is the biggest challenge. So they will ask questions to the Thai people, how Thailand could get out of this poverty trap. So there are many traps, maybe. So we'll get to these complicated issues. But more polished questions is now look at this diverse growth performance. And some countries were very successful. The other was not successful, being trapped in the middle-income status. Then what are the effective policies for maintaining strong and persistent growth, making the middle-income countries to get out of the middle-income status and to become the high-income status? And then this is basically based on the more likely a broad sample of countries. And then I'll get to the specific case briefly on the South Korea. Well, you can ask the questions, why you look at the broad number of countries? Each country may have unique historical and institutional features. So maybe cross-country comparative analysis ignore country uniqueness. Maybe Thailand is different from Malaysia. Thailand is different from Singapore. Korea is different from Japan. China may be big country. It's different from the other middle-income countries. But we can start from this kind of broad comparison and then see, trying to identify common features that can be observed in successful countries compared to the non-successful countries, and then see whether this could be applied to the particular countries. That may be the good steps. So of course, I mean, we can focus on the one country's very specific examples, but the approach here is we can start from the broad sample of evidence and then trying to see how much that were applied to the South Korean examples. So this kind of approach I've just explained here. My objective here is of course, I try to investigate the sources of sustained long-term growth, particularly in the middle-income countries. But I try to see this kind of complicated growth episode, like the convergence, non-convergence, middle-income traps, non-middle-income traps. Many economists are saying, but empirically, I'm trying to distinguish this different episode. What are the major causes of the growth success in many successfully transitioning from the middle income to the high income countries? I think that would be relevant to Thai case. Okay, this is based on some academic papers. I'm trying to introduce some non-technical part. But if you are interested in some technical analysis, you can see these two papers. So let me first, before starting some empirical presentation, I'm trying to give some concepts of some growth episode, income convergence because the income convergence means we are interested in how to reduce the gaps between my country and the advanced countries, the target country. Here, just to make sure, I want to make the United States the target country for every country, so it's make it easier. And then growth decelerations. Income convergence is narrowing the gap, but some countries' growth rate, or as I showed in the Latin American countries, slow down very quickly. So this is the growth deceleration. And then some countries suffered from the growth deceleration and then being trapped in the middle income status. That's the middle income trap. So I'm trying to show these concepts. So there are some kind of theory. I'll go very briefly about the theoretical framework. The theoretical framework called conditional convergence theory. So this economic theory says we can use the conditional convergence theory to explain the evolution of the per capita income level and growth rate of the many countries in the world. And then trying to prove that over time, and then quite relevant to explaining the growth experience. So here, a country with very lower income, they start growth process. And then initially, the growth rate would be much higher than richer countries. That's the basic proposition. Because each country has its potential target per capita income. This potential target per capita income will be determined by other things. But let's assume that's the US level, or this is South Korea level. And then, at the beginning, the gap in your human capital or physical capital and technology will be very high. So return is much higher because there are very small physical capital stock. Investment would have a much higher return. And technological progress, productivity is much higher because your technology is very limited. So initially growth rate would be higher. But if you narrow the gap to the advanced countries, to the US, it's much more difficult to catch up. It's getting more difficult. So people often confusing this difficulty in catching up over time because the rate of return is declining, or just benefiting from the imitating advanced technology as a trap. Trap is different. Even very successful countries like South Korea always getting into the difficult in catching up with the high-income countries because developing innovative technology is very difficult at current stage of the South Korea. Korea was much easier in 1970s to developing export industries. But 1990, 2000 is more difficult. So this is getting difficult is the convergence. Trap is you are making some mistakes and then you cannot overcome a kind of shock and then you just stay in the middle income. So that's the basic concept here. So distinguishing this concept is very important. Otherwise, people often think being trapped is a destiny. So my country is staying in the middle income for 20 years. Oh, I understand it's becoming higher income country is always difficult. How we could develop innovative capability like the US. Yes, it's difficult. That's the theory says that. But that does not mean it's much more difficult than getting out of the poverty. That was much more difficult. So once the country was successful getting out from the very low income trap, you can actually maintain sustained growth if you don't make any mistakes and you can keep the fundamental factors I will explain later, then you can become the high income countries. That's the basic message, and then I try to explain that. And the theory says growth rate of an economy declines as it approaches its steady state. So, like the China maintains very strong growth over time, but the growth rate will decline because, again, they grow very fast. So the gap of their current level of the physical capital stock and human capital stock and technology from their potential have been narrowed down. The theory says your growth rate will decline. That's a natural process. That does not mean the country will be trapped. The country will go smoothly, even though at a slower speed, to become the advanced countries if they don't make any mistakes. So this process takes very long time. You cannot really jump to the high-income countries, the theory says. So then, okay, now my country is now in the transition from a middle-income status to the high-income countries. What are the determinants? The theory says 3 factors are important. First one is your technological progress rate. How much you promote your technology, productivity over time. And then second one is your gap. The gap between your current level of the per capita income or your current level of the labor productivity and your potential. So potential will be determined by your policy. So if you make the good policies, you make the good reform in your institutions, you'll improve your potential, and then your growth rate will be faster. So China's growth is not really depending on just your gap was bigger. They continue to improve their policies. They continue to reform their institutions. That your potential will be higher and higher. So people will ask, can you guess what would be the potential income level for China? China will become the US level in 2040, like Xi Jinping says. That all you can calculate actually. The paper I just explain about that. How the country will grow up. But that's about China. Let's forget about China. And then third one is where you are located in. So based on this kind of assumptions, you can calculate actually the growth path of each country and then see whether your country is following good path or bad path. So this kind of logic you can do. This is you can say, oh, this is pretty much economics. Yes, this is pretty much other things also important, like politics and then also international relations. All kinds of things would be developed, would have a significant impact on the economic performance. But let's forget about the other things. Just focus on economic issues. And then this kind of economic theory says how the country will develop over time. So I just put some graph. Here the graph is this vertical axis is your relative per capita income to United States. So it's starting from the 10%. So just assume your per capita income was 10% of the US level in 1960. And then you are growing up and then narrowing down the gap. So you can see the 3 passes, the thick line here. This one is the benchmark. It's just put some numbers and then showing what theory says. If the country has a technological progress rate like the United States, on average, the same progress rate, like about 2%, and then you start from the 10%, your target level of your potential per capita income is about 60% of the US. So the country, think about any country like China. Let's assume that China's potential is about 60% of the US per capita income in 20 years and 30 years. It's just hypothetically. Then the country's growth path is like this. And then this is the GDP growth rate, per capita GDP growth rate. So the country over the past half century, you start from the 10% of the US per capita income, it will reach to about 34% of the US per capita income. It's very slow, but you can narrow down the gap. And then your growth rate is about 5.5%. It starts a little bit higher rate and then going down. Of course, there are several paths. If you assume better conditions, starting with the same relative level of the per capita income, like the 10% of the US level, and then your technological progress rate is much higher, and then your potential level is exactly like the US, then the country will follow this better line. And then growth rate on average is much higher, over 6%. If the country technological progress rate is lower, much lower, and then your potential level is much lower because your policy is very bad, then it will follow here. So based on this kind of the assumptions, If you like, you can put the Thailand as a kind of benchmark countries based on some assumptions what kind of the path the Thailand is following. Of course, if we look at the actual number, there are a lot of fluctuations, but this is just the long-term trend because over time, your living standard depends on the long-term performance. So every year you can go much better or much lower, but much poor, but your long-term performance is very important. So one issue here is that you don't want to stay here. Very low performance. Your technological progress rate is very low. Your potential is very low because the poor policies and poor institutions and the poor human capital. I'll explain what data says. Which factor is most important in distinguishing these three lines or many lines in the world over the past half century. But another important issue is maybe one country like Mexico. I don't want to get into the Thailand because without knowing much about Thailand, you will criticize me. So you don't know about Mexico, so I'll just pick up the Mexico. So let's say Mexico was here. You are going very well. You will become like US in 60 years, the data says. But you made mistakes. You got into the crisis. You down here. And then you got another crisis. You down again. You just stay here, then you cannot get out of this low-income path. This is a disaster. Because initially, you were much better. Everything was very rosy, very bright. But all of a sudden, you are getting into the growth deceleration, growth slowdown, big drop. And then maybe not just once, several times. That's the disaster. So now getting back to the concept. Convergence. Income convergence means that you are growing, even though not very fast, slowly, but you are narrowing the gap to the US. Well, you can pick up any countries, your target countries, like Japan, you can narrow the gap in the per capita income by doing something. What is the something? So we'll explain that. So if you want to be a high-income countries, you need to be a higher path of growth. You don't want to stay in the bottom path. You want to go to the better path. Another issue is you need to avoid downward shift. You don't want to get into the lower income, lower growth path by making mistakes. So middle income trap is let's say, Thailand is in the middle income trap. You will make a judgment, but maybe Thailand case was here, and then got into the crisis. Asian financial crisis, maybe in the low growth path, or you can see maybe Thailand is the much bigger drop, and then here. I mean, you need to distinguish it. Maybe if you are still staying here, not very bad. If you are going down here, it's too bad. So you need to think of getting upward. How to getting upward? I mean, that's important. So here basically, I'm trying to distinguish growth process with growth deceleration. Trap means that you getting down in the 1980s, and then you stayed in the 10 years. This is the hypothetical experiment. And then sometimes you are getting out of the trap. That means you are not actually being trapped. Maybe Thailand is in the same process. It was bad experiencing crisis in the 1980s. Maybe another country is like Mexico you are not really going back to the better path. That's too bad. So this is I just explained the concept. And then now getting to the data issues and empirically what data says in the 110 countries. So let's start from the middle income economies. What are the middle income countries? There are a lot of definitions. But here I'm using the relative income perspective. So because I'm only interested in the narrowing per capita income gap to the advanced economies, not the absolute growth rate number. You want to be a high-income countries. What is the high-income countries? High-income countries means that you want to be a high-income countries at this moment, like US and Japan. So narrowing the gap is important. So based on this relative income, I just used 5% and 40% as two criteria. So if country's per capita income is lower than 5% of the US level, that's the low-income countries. Between 5% and 40% are middle-income countries. Above 40% is the high-income countries. So we are not saying that you should be a US to be a high-income countries. Once you become the Western European countries, it's okay. You are the high-income countries. So 40% is the good. So this figure looks complicated, but in the 1960 versus 2014, 1960 per capita income is divided into the three groups. Low income, 0.5, 40% is middle income, and then high income countries, and then 2014. So these countries are very important. 14 economies. These 14 economies, 1960s, they were low income countries, and then 2014, they become the high income countries. They are very successful countries. I'll call them as a convergence success because they become the high-income countries. So these countries are including China, not China, so South Korea, I'm sorry, South Korea, Ireland, and there's many, you can see the Malta, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan, these countries, Spain, and these countries are here. Where is Thailand? Thailand is here. So it's not really high-income countries based on my criteria, or it's the actually common criteria. Actually, Chinese government is using this criteria, or World Bank is using this criteria. So it's not reached to 40% of the US level. But one important point here is that, well, China and Thailand started very low income in 1960, and then now move to the very high level. Look at the Ireland or Spain. In 1960, they were already very close to the high-income status, and then they just jumped a very small amount to become the high-income countries. So even though middle-income countries, the big question is the long-term performance. So in this criteria, China, India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand are classifying as very successful countries, convergence success, even though they are not in high-income countries. Their performance was excellent, and if they could continue current growth rate, they will become the high-income countries. So these countries are different from the Mexico and Brazil and other middle-income countries. Their growth rate is very low. So identification of the convergence success, successful countries. So I'm not really inventing this to come to the Thailand to say, oh, Thailand is a convergence success. It's not a failing countries. If you look at the broad number of countries, they jumped from the very low income countries to the very high middle income countries. And then if we just wait 10 years, they will approach to the 40% of the US income, even though it takes time. So middle-income countries, there are basically will become the high-income countries, and then this is called convergence success. Some countries are already high-income countries, so they already completed the transition process. One particular example is South Korea. Another country is still strong growth, but it started late, and then has some problems. So it will take more time to become the high-income countries. Particular country is the Thailand. So these countries are all successful countries. So these are the convergence success countries. I put so many examples, but you can see. What is the growth deceleration? And then middle-income countries. Growth deceleration is here the definition is the countries over the 7 years, they were very good. Over 3% per capita average growth, and then all of a sudden going downward. As I explained, the lower income growth path, and then their growth rate is more than 2% slowdown, big drop. This is growth deceleration, and then some of these countries just stay there. They are middle income traps. So I hope this is clear, but it's let's show some numbers. Like China and South Korea are convergence success. They are very successful growing countries, but they also suffered from some growth decelerations. Now look at they handle it. So they don't want to show you the China and Korea, so move to another countries. I cannot move, so okay. So the point here is that in plain language, even very successful countries will suffer crisis. So trend is the important, how the country is going past, but also how to overcome the crisis is important. So Korea had a poor crisis based on this experience. So long-term growth rate was all of a sudden sharply down, more than 2 percentage points, so 4 times. But they overcome, they maintain the high growth. Look at the other countries, like just Brazil and Mexico. Look at Mexico. There was only one big crisis in 1980, Mexico crisis. Then you look at the slope, significant slowdown, and then it's much lower growth. So here the question is, if you become the very successful countries, transitioning from the middle income to high income status, you should maintain strong long-term growth, but also it should be persistent. You should getting out of the shocks. So this window. So what happened to the Thailand here? So Thailand has in my definition, there are 3 growth slowdowns. It's not trapped in the middle income status, but growth rate was the significant slowdown after Asian financial crisis. So you can see the growth rate is this is only over the 7 years, the average. So for 1995 was identified as a turning point. Before, growth rate was over 7 years, 7.8%. Since 1995, over 7 years, only 1.3%. So significant shock to the economy, but it has been recovering. But now you can see recently it has been also slowdowns. I want to just getting into the one issue. Oh, that means, as I explained at the beginning, it is now more difficult to become the high-income countries because we are already very upper level of the middle-income countries. That's not true. If we look at the growth experience, this chart shows that each country is over 5 years where the country was in terms of the relative per capita income, and then what percentage of countries suffered from the growth slowdowns and then become the middle-income country being trapped. You can see at the beginning of the development, more likely to be trapped at the low-income status. So that's why many African countries are still staying in the low-income traps. It's more difficult at the beginning. Later, actually much easier, less frequent to become being trapped. Of course, now countries are looking at the current status, it's more difficult. But convergence process says it's natural to become more difficult to grow at the same speed unless you do very serious reform or change in the policies suitable to the better conditions in your changing environment. So now let's get into some determinant empirical strategy. I'll just explain that because it's a little bit technical, so I don't want to really getting into the technical issues. So I'll just explain that this is combining the 75 economies and then see what are actually distinguishing this different growth episode. So at the 5-year intervals. So just getting into showing some result here. So look at each variable. So I classified all important determinant identified previous studies, like some human capital issues, demographic data, and then macroeconomic variables, economic structures, and then trade variables, and technological factors, and classified them, and then identify each variables. And the plus means this variable is identified as having positive relations to becoming the convergence success. Oh, sorry, it's going too fast. The convergence success. And then there is some star means the statistically significant or not. I mean, there are 3 stars means a very significant factor. So you can see there are identifying factors. This is the important. So this kind of regressions, we call the regressions, controlling some other variables, it shows that probability of convergence success, like the Korea and China, are strongly associated with demographic and human capital factors, such as schooling, fertility, life expectancy, and dependency ratios. So these kind of the variables are very important. Also, convergence success tend to have better maintenance of the rule of law, low inflation, and free international trade, and high investment rate, and low price of investment goods, and low public debt. This is compared to the non-successful countries. That's why I'm explaining. And then foreign direct investment, financial opening, and particularly high technological export and patent are identified as a very important factor to become convergence success. So this identified here. And then you want to avoid the middle income trap. This is the avoiding the significant growth deceleration. It's not really going to convergence success. It's a separate concept. This is the probability of being the middle income trap. If the country has, there are several factors, is the world's economic variables like human capital factors, especially the manufacturing export and high technological export is again become the very important. And also, one important thing is to avoid being trapped in the middle income status, you need to avoid the very rapid increase in investment, very hasty deregulation, and then significant increase in the financial opening. These kind of variables were identified as a variable caused the middle income trap. So there are some other technical investigations, but let me just here let me summarize very briefly, and then going to quickly to the South Korean case. Okay, let's think about what I'm trying to say. Well, you need to distinguish between convergence success and the middle income trap, and then actually there is no clear pattern supporting the middle income trap hypothesis. And then convergence success. So basically each country, like Thailand, want to be a convergence success and avoid the middle income trap. Then what should it do? Tend to maintain strong human capital, large working age population ratio, effective rule of law, low price of investment goods, and high level of high technological export and patent. These factors are also important to avoid being in the middle income trap, but also rapid investment expansion and hasty deregulation are actually causing the middle income trap. So you need to be very careful in the changing your policies or making mistakes. So Korea's case, let's now we look at the 110 countries. Now look at only South Korea. I just put the South Korea and Japan and United States. Yes, South Korea's experience was remarkable. Now South Korea's per capita income is over 27,000, and then it's the world's 8th largest trading countries. So it was started from the only less than $100 in 1960. So remarkable performance. Now catch up to the advanced countries, including Japan and the US. So what caused? So the paper I mentioned actually doing applied the same framework only to South Korea. And then South Korea, actually there was the conditional convergence effect. South Korea's growth rate has been declining over time. That's the natural process. But South Korea's growth rate on average was much higher than the other comparison group. Why? The target growth rate potential was much higher. It's going to the very advanced countries because it has very strong investment, low fertility, high trade openness, and macroeconomic stability, and continuously improving the quality of human resources and institutions. Korea's success is in particularly driven by the manufacturing and export-driven growth, as everyone knows. Export-oriented policies designed to provide incentives to export firms based on their performance, giving reward to the best performers, were very effective in pushing the pace of change in competitive advantage. And then Korea actually suffered from the two big crises, but overcame the crisis very well because continuously changing the policies and institutions. Some numbers, look at Korea's case. Korea's investment rate were very high. It started a very low level, here the yellow color. It was only 10% in 1960. It was over 40% in the 1990s. It has slowed down after the crisis, but still very strong investment. Export performance was remarkable, and then actually export share increased very rapidly. It started from the 1 digit, and now is the 56% of the GDP. So very high export-oriented countries. That makes the countries a little bit vulnerable. I'll explain that, but it shows the strong performance. Human capital accumulation, here measured by average years of schooling for adult population. It was only 4 years in the 1960s. It's now very close to the US, now 12 years of the average years of schooling. So human capital improvement is very important because it contributing to the higher labor productivity. But also in Korea's context was very important in moving up the value chain. Export value chain. If you want to move to the more technologically advanced industries, you need better human capitals. How to get the better human capital? If you have a foreign direct investment, you cannot really make the foreigners to operate foreign direct investment firms. You need local people, very capable people. So you need better quality education. So Korea was relatively successful in making that, innovating the country as well as the upgrading human capital together. So you can see the Korea's comparative advantage. It started very labor-intensive manufacturing and then moved to the more capital and technology-intensive industries, including electronics. Look at the 1960 major export with iron ore. In 1980 was textile, now semiconductors and cell phones and automobiles and chemicals. So this kind of change, you need to develop competitive advantage in technology. As I explained, I identified that if you want to be a convergence success while avoiding the middle income trap, your high technological export was important. So basically technological development together with the human capital was important. So, but again, South Korea case was it's not very smooth transition. This is just to show big dramatic effect. I just measured by the US dollars, nominal US dollars. It's a big significant decline because big change in the exchange rate. But Korea overcame all crises very rapidly. So doing a lot of the reforms, so that's explained that Korea is now one of the countries with big income with populations. I'll just say a few things because this may be relevant to Thailand maybe in decades. Well, you can become the high-income countries. You can develop into the high-income countries like South Korea. But as I explained, everywhere you are getting into the new problems, new challenges. You need to be more adjusted to the overcoming the new crisis. So Korea's case is obviously convergence. Strong convergence means that now physical capital, human capital level is very close to the advanced countries like US. So rate of return is much lower. You cannot develop the countries based on the physical capital and human capital, maybe different from the Thailand. And then problem of the South Korea is the technological progress rate measured by total productivity growth has been slowed down. So actually very low, becomes lower and lower. So that's another problem, how to develop it. And then country was heavily dependent on export, especially since 2000, heavily dependent on Chinese market. So they make very susceptible to the China's slowdown, fluctuation in China. So this imbalances between export industries and domestic industries, and between manufacturing and service sectors, between large exporting companies and small and medium domestic-oriented companies were big problem in South Korea. So South Korea's problem is more structured nowadays. How to reduce these gaps? was very important, especially relatively low productivity in service sectors, now big challenge, how to improve service sectors. Like that was the problem in the many advanced countries, kind of natural process. So what happened to South Korea? Basically, we cannot avoid two fundamental factors. One is the slow convergence. We already accumulated, become a rich country, slow convergence path. Slow working age population, a very rapid aging process. Working age population in absolute numbers start to decline from this year. But as I said, the future is not predestined. The Korea is also need to do a lot of better policies and institutional reforms. So we'll see what will happen to South Korea. If you invite me 10 years later, I'll explain what happened to South Korea in 10 years. Mainly, it may depend on what North Korea will do over the next decade. So, let me summarize what I have said. You can see some cartoon here. So, let's say every country in Southeast Asia too want to be a smoothly high-income countries. So, what should we do? We need to follow the strong convergence path and then avoiding falling into the low-income trap, low-growth traps, or they call the middle-income traps. So I already explained several factors, but strong demographic factors and sound policies were very important. Also improving export competitiveness. How to improve export competitiveness? Because it's a challenge. And then also carefully managing macroeconomic and financial vulnerabilities, because once you get into the crisis, the shock may make the economy stay in the low growth path without coming back to the high income path. So Korea's experience actually proved that kind of the argument that you need a strong convergence and sustained growth with continuous policy effort. So this end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll take that. Thank you.
ครับสำหรับตอนนี้นะครับท่านไหนครับที่มีคำถามสามารถยกมือขึ้นแล้วถามได้เลยนะครับสักครู่ครับเดี๋ยวไมค์จะวิ่งไปหานะครับ
Aslan, you are preparing for a very tough question, I'm sure. Have any microphone? Yeah, please.
ครับไมค์นะครับตอนนี้ไมค์
Thank you, Jongwa. Your lecture is excellent as usual. My question is, in Thailand there is a belief that a success story of Korean economy is largely due to the government intervention in the sense that in the import substitution industrialization manner. Do you have any comment on this belief? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I mean, the question is in general very important questions on the role of the government. So, what was the role of the government, particularly in South Korea? So, in South Korea's context, the most important government intervention was the promoting export industries. How to promote export industries? There are several things, but there are some direct intervention, but indirect intervention was also very important, like the exchange rate or depreciation, and then as you mentioned, this changing from the import substitution to the export orientation by reducing protectionist measures, and then setting up the export promoting zones to invite the foreign technology, especially at that time from Japan. There was also important government initiatives. But having said that, that does not mean all kind of government intervention were very successful in South Korea. There were also failures caused by the strong government interventions. But in general, relate to the export orientation, developing export industries, Korea's intervention was quite successful, especially Korea's case, always trying to give the reward to the export firms based on the performance. So this kind of incentive mechanism, especially economists are saying that worked very well. I mean, you were very successful in increasing your export performance, government gave a lot of the new incentives to those export firms. But financial interventions some caused some problems in the Korean context.
ตอนนี้ขออีกหนึ่งคำถามครับคำถามสุดท้ายแล้วครับ
I have two questions for you.
Yeah. Okay.
First, 30 to 40 years ago, Thailand and Korea are very similar in economic situations. What made Korean economy in about 30 years that surpassed close to Japan? That's one of my first questions. Second question is the effect of the North Korea, the deteriorating of the North Korean regime, will going to have the effect on the South Korean economics in the next 5 years or 10 years.
Okay,
You got
both questions are very difficult. It'll take a long time, but let's say just a couple of things on first of all, comparing South Korea to Thailand. I mean, please consider me as not expert on the Thailand economy, even though I was the ADB's chief economist. The point here, I cannot really go back to. Okay, this one is showing the performance based on the two countries. Sorry. So, as you just mentioned that two countries started quite a similar level of the per capita income at the early stage. And then you can see the two thick lines, and then this green line is the South Korea, and then Thailand was below thick lines, and then the gap becomes larger and larger starting from the 1970s and 80s. So that part, actually the South Korea was actually developing the new export industries and then moving toward the new export industries in which it developed the comparative advantage. So how to developing the new comparative advantage in the new industries are very complicated questions. There are some role made by the government, and also the private sectors did well. So what actually caused them is a long story. But as I explained at this stage, I would say that this developing export competitiveness would be important issue. And then again, I mean after getting into the crisis, how to overcome, and then returning to the strong growth path was especially important after Asian financial crisis in making the two countries showing the two different paths. So I would say that was important. Over the next 5 years, whether this development in the North Korea's nuclear and the missiles would have a significant impact on the South Korea, that depending on the Jong-un Kim, so North Korean leader, not to me, but he's highly unpredictable. At this moment we see the probability of a war, especially between South and North Korea, is rather limited, even though we cannot rule out the possibility. And the probability of the North Korea's collapse due to any instability would be also low because of the strong support from the China. So having said that, whether North Korea would have a significant impact on the South Korea in economy is very limited, because the economic gap between South Korea and North Korea is very, very big. So even, let's say, the North Korea collapse, and then South Korea should support the North Korea, the shock will be significant at the first, say, the few years, but it could overcome like what Germany did. Even though the gap is, per capita income gap is very large, but the country is very small. But security is a different story. I mean, the security is North Korea has a military power, always threaten the security of the South Korea. So we'll see that. So I would not give the answer, because your question is mostly depending on the security issues. Everyone knows security in Korean Peninsula is not depending on the South and North Korea alone. That all depending on the big players, including China, US, and also the Russia. So that will make a big impact on the security in the Korean Peninsula. That will have some economic implications, but I would see maybe it's not really getting into any significant disaster, catastrophe by the war, and I hope that. So maybe we are running out of the time. Thank you very much for your attention again, and thank you very much.
ในลำดับถัดไปขอเรียนเชิญคณะบดีมอบของที่ระลึกพร้อมทั้งถ่ายรูปร่วมกันค่ะ
ขอขอบคุณท่านคณะบดีครับตอนนี้นะครับก็เป็นเวลาทานอาหารกลางวันของเราทุกคนแล้วครับขอแจ้งนะครับว่าห้องรับประทานอาหารของเราคือห้อง603นะครับเดี๋ยวทุกท่านนะครับออกจากห้องสัมมนาแล้วลงบันไดด้านล่างนะครับลงบันไดเลื่อนไปเลยก่อนจะแยกย้ายกันไปครับกระผมขอ